90 minutes a week and mortality drops? That is insane. Like the body is begging for a tiny favor. That's the whole thing, right? We wait way too long. Medicine mostly shows up after the fire is already eating the house. And then we act surprised the couch is gone. That is such a brutal way to put it. But it's kind of true for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all of it. The interesting part is that the damage starts way earlier than people think. We all live like the bill comes due at 60. Then 65 arrives and suddenly everybody is deeply spiritual. Man, the human species is hilarious. What hits me is that he's not even saying panic earlier, just pay attention earlier. That's a way better pitch than wellness culture nonsense. No green juice sermon, just do not ignore the math. And the math is ugly because slow death is the main enemy now. Fast death got defeated by science, then slow death moved in quietly. That's actually a terrifying sequel. It is, though, because living longer is not the same as living well. That split between lifespan and health span is the whole frame. And I think people hear longevity and think vanity, but it's really function. Nobody wants to be alive for 20 extra years and miserable. That is not a premium subscription I want. No, that is the worst deal imaginable. What I liked is how he connects physical health and emotional health. Because most people still pretend those are separate worlds. They're not, and everybody knows somebody who learned that the hard way. The marriage, the anger, the workaholism, that's the part that lands. You can be medically fit and still be wrecked as a person. That line about living a bad life while being physically healthy is nasty. It's nasty because it's honest. And honestly, that's the uncomfortable upgrade here. Medicine 3.0 is not just screens and biomarkers. It's risk as a long game, not a 10-year spreadsheet. That part about doctors obsessing over the risk of acting, not the risk of waiting, is huge. Because if you're 30, everything looks fine today. Congratulations, you're immortal until the invoice shows up. That should be printed on every gym wall. The point is that your arteries don't care about your calendar optimism. And family history changes the whole conversation too. If heart disease is in the family, ignoring it is not philosophy. It's just procrastination dressed up as confidence. Damn, that's mean but accurate. I also like that he doesn't shame young people for not caring yet. He basically says youth gives you runway, but also makes you lazy. Which is just human nature being annoying again. You only get scared when mortality taps your shoulder. For a lot of people, that happens with kids, or a funeral, or a scare. Or a pandemic, which honestly rewired a lot of minds. That was a real turning point for him and for a lot of us. Suddenly, metabolic health wasn't abstract anymore. It was on the screen, loud, ugly, impossible to ignore. Nature was basically yelling at everybody. And then you realize exercise is not aesthetic, it's armor. Same with sleep, same with stress, same with nutrition. The boring stuff is always the dangerous stuff to skip. Always, because nobody wants the boring answer. The muscle aging point was also interesting because it flips the script. Some things improve with age, some start slipping immediately. So aging is not one clean decline, it's a bunch of separate clocks. That's actually such a useful mental model. Because people think they are either young or old like one switch. But your muscles, your cognition, your arteries, they are all doing different things. That makes prevention feel less moral and more tactical. Which is probably why it works better. Exactly, nobody wants another lecture. The emotional health section is where it gets much deeper. Because then it's not just living longer, it's becoming someone you respect. That funeral story was devastating in a quiet way. Resume virtues versus eulogy virtues is a brutal mirror. Everybody wants the resume, nobody wants the reckoning. Until the funeral does the editing for you. That's sick, but yeah, exactly. And that is why trauma matters in a longevity conversation. Because a lot of self-destruction is just pain in disguise. Or discipline used as a hiding place. He seems to be saying if your inner life is collapsing, the rest is decoration. Which is a hard thing to admit when your whole identity is achievement. That hit because plenty of people are secretly built that way. They are high-functioning until they are not. The most dangerous kind of broken. The polished disaster category. What I respect is that he includes himself in the problem. That makes the whole thing feel less preachy and more credible. Like, okay, this guy actually had to face it too. And that's why the conversation lands as a challenge, not advice. Because the real question is not just what kills you. It's what kind of life you're practicing while you're still here. That's the uncomfortable part people avoid. And this episode basically refuses to let you hide. We should leave it there for now because that is already a lot. And honestly, it's a lot in the best way. Next time, we should get into what it actually means to personalize prevention. Because that's where the real arguments start. Episode 2 is where we get into the messy part of biomarkers, risk, and trade-offs. That's exactly where it gets dangerous because the body keeps score before you feel it. And medicine keeps waiting for you to feel it, which is kind of insane. Like, come back when you are broken enough to qualify for attention. That whole split between fast death and slow death is brutal. Fast death is the old world, and slow death is the modern trap. Because now we live long enough to get hit by the long game. Exactly, and that changes everything about how you think. The weird part is people still act like a clean bill of health means safety. Meanwhile, the damage is just politely renovating the inside of you. That is such a horrible image, but also completely true. And the whole point is that waiting for symptoms is already late. That 10-year horizon thing is where my brain starts fighting back. Because at 30, everyone thinks the problem is a future self problem. Then future self shows up like, hey, remember me? And now suddenly you are trying to negotiate with biology. The lifetime view is the whole argument, not the 10-year view. That is the part most people do not want to hear. They want permission to ignore it until the calendar feels older. But by then, the ship is already turning too slowly. That Titanic metaphor is annoying because it lands so well. Hate when a metaphor is this effective. And the scary thing is the iceberg is not one event. It is years of not noticing what is building. That is why prevention sounds boring until you realize it is leverage. Like absurd amounts of leverage. Even that exercise stat is wild, from 0 activity to 90 minutes a week. 15% reduction in all-cause mortality off that jump is crazy. Your body is basically saying, wow, you finally remembered me. And that is not even elite behavior, that is just movement. Which makes the bar feel embarrassingly low. Right, and that's the whole frustration with the current system. Medicine 1.0 solved infection and trauma, which is huge. Medicine 2.0 doubled life expectancy, which people forget is massive. But then we got comfortable and stopped updating the playbook. Classic human behavior. Solve one monster, then ignore the next one. And the next monster is slower, quieter, and way more expensive. I love that he did not pretend Medicine 2.0 is useless. He's saying it was a giant upgrade, just not the final one. That distinction matters because otherwise people get defensive immediately. Doctors hear criticism and act like you insulted their ancestors. Fair, but also maybe don't make prevention optional by default. The risk conversation is where it becomes genuinely interesting. Because doctors are trained to fear the risk of action. But they underweight the risk of not acting for 10, 20, 40 years, which is a very different kind of harm. Exactly, and biomarker thinking forces that argument into the open. Like nothing is wrong right now, but something is already being written. Your arteries are apparently doing their own little side project. Horrific, but useful. And the family history part makes it more personal instantly. If your uncle died young from cardiovascular disease, that is not trivia. That is a signal that should change how you think about time. Yet most people still file that stuff under someday. Someday is a very lazy medical strategy. It really is the most expensive word in health. And then there is the emotional health piece, which is the real gut punch. Because he is not treating that as a soft add-on. He is saying if your emotional health is collapsing, the rest matters less. That is such a hard thing to admit out loud, especially when your outward life looks optimized. That was the most interesting contradiction in the whole conversation. Healthy body, unhealthy life, and that mismatch is brutal. Workaholism is basically socially approved self-destruction. And then people clap because you are productive. That funeral story changes the temperature of everything. Resume virtues versus eulogy. Virtues is such a devastating lens. Because one is about achievement, and the other is about being remembered well. Turns out LinkedIn does not follow you to the grave. Brutal, but also please frame that quote somewhere. What hit me is how much of our ambition is just misdirected fear. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being left behind, fear of silence. And trauma can wire that whole machine without you noticing, which is why the final chapter matters so much. He basically says the doctor stops and the patient starts. That switch is powerful because it removes the expert shield. He is not above it, he is inside it. Exactly. And that makes the whole message more honest. I think that is why people trust this stuff more than generic health advice. It is not perfection. It is pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is hard when you are emotionally invested in denial. Denial is very efficient until it is catastrophic. That's the whole episode in one sentence, honestly. You are not just trying to add years, you are trying to add a better self. And that is the part people need to sit with. Because the easy version of health is just protein shakes and guilt. And that is not even close to the real conversation. The real conversation is time, decline, identity, and what you ignore. Which is a little uncomfortable, but also kind of freeing. Because once you see the slow death problem, you cannot unsee it. We should pause there because that lands exactly where it should. Episode 2 is where we get into biomarkers, trade-offs, and the messy personalization question. That is where the arguments actually start. The wild part is that modern medicine got amazing at stopping fast death. And then it just kind of shrugged at the slow stuff. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, all quietly building. Like a horrible subscription you forgot to cancel. Peter's whole point is that the default playbook is too late. We wait for symptoms like that as a strategy. That is not strategy, that is panic with paperwork. And Medicine 3.0 is basically saying, stop being reactive. Prevention, personalization, and long-term risk have to come first. But people love the illusion that if they feel fine, they are fine. That is the most expensive lie in health, especially because the disease can start at birth. That part is actually scary if you sit with it. You can have real coronary disease before anyone calls you sick. So the body is negotiating in silence for decades. And the scary thing is how normal that sounds after a while. He keeps coming back to time horizons, which is the real twist. Doctors often think in 10-year windows, but life is not 10 years, unless you are budgeting like a maniac and dying young, which is such a bleak finance bro metaphor, but okay. The point lands, though. Low short-term risk can still mean huge lifetime risk. So at 30, you look healthy and get told nothing is wrong. Meanwhile, the future is quietly collecting interest. That is the part people resist because it asks for effort before urgency. Humans are basically urgency addicts. We only behave when the fire alarm is loud enough, or when the pandemic slaps everyone in the face at once. That was the wake-up call for a lot of people, honestly. Because suddenly metabolic health was not abstract anymore. It was visible, and visible things scare us into action. I like that he does not treat exercise like a lifestyle accessory. He treats it like future insurance with compounding returns. Which is annoying because that is actually convincing. Also kind of offensive to my lazy side. Your lazy side is not built for actuarial tables. Bro, that line alone should be on a poster. The other thing that hit me was his own honesty about emotional health. He is not pretending the body can be perfect while the life is broken. That is actually a much tougher claim than the fitness stuff. Because you can optimize sleep and still be a wreck. He was saying exactly that about himself. Physically disciplined, emotionally miserable, basically. And that makes the whole longevity conversation feel more honest. Otherwise, it turns into body worship with good branding. Which honestly is half the internet health content. The funeral story is where it gets real, though. That shift from resume virtues to eulogy virtues is brutal. Because it forces the question nobody likes answering. What do people say about you when the title is gone? And a lot of people would rather not know. We have all met someone who is 5% character and 95% LinkedIn. That is a devastating sentence. But it explains why workaholism feels noble until it starts eating your life. You think you are building a legacy and you are actually building avoidance. That is the uncomfortable part of the book. The final chapter basically says the doctor becomes the patient. That move is so strong because it breaks the expert shield. Nobody wants the longevity guy to admit he was miserable. But that admission is exactly why it matters. Because now the question is not just how long do I live. It is what kind of person am I becoming while I am doing it. That is the line that makes the whole thing bigger than health. It becomes identity, relationships, regret, and the stories we tell ourselves. And trauma sits right inside that mess, whether we like it or not. Because so many weird behaviors are not random at all. They are adaptations that outlive their usefulness. which is a polite way of saying broken coping mechanisms. Polite, but yes, exactly. And that is why his framing hits harder than a normal medicine talk. He is not only talking about avoiding disease, he is talking about avoiding a hollow life. That is a much scarier diagnosis, because nobody can prescribe their way out of that one. Exactly, and that is why the emotional piece belongs here. Healthspan is not just fewer pills and better labs. It is also whether you are present, connected, and decent to people, which is inconvenient because that part cannot be hacked overnight. But that is also what makes it meaningful. You can start young, or at least start before the emergency starts. That is the big challenge this whole conversation leaves hanging. How do you get motivated without being scared into a wall? Because waiting for a heart attack is not a wellness plan. That one is free, by the way. And the best part is he makes prevention feel less like punishment, more like building optionality for the future, which is a lot less sexy but a lot more real. That is where we should leave this one, because it is the real cliffhanger. If you ignore the slow build, the bill arrives all at once. Episode 2 gets into the biomarkers, the trade-offs, and the messy personalization fights. That is where everybody suddenly has an opinion. That line about the bill arriving all at once is brutal. And honestly, that is the whole trick with health. People think disease is a moment, but it is usually a drip. Then one day your body sends the final invoice. And by then everybody is acting surprised, which is insane. Peter's whole point is that medicine is too late by design. It waits for the fire, then gets heroic about the smoke. That's such a good way to insult the system without sounding academic. But it is also fair, because it really did save us from fast death. Like infection, trauma, all the old stuff that used to wipe people out. We won that war and then immediately got sloppy. Exactly, because now the enemy is slow and boring and everywhere. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, all building quietly. And the crazy part is the clock starts way earlier than people think. He says some of this starts the minute you're born, which is a pretty rude feature of biology, honestly. Biology is not customer service at all. That part about atherosclerosis being there already was wild. Not a heart attack yet, but the machinery is already degrading. That is the part people hate hearing, because it removes the illusion of safety. And illusions are very comfortable until they bankrupt you. The 10-year risk lens is the sneaky problem there. At 30, your risk looks tiny, so medicine shrugs. But lifetime risk is the actual story, not the short spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is always the villain in these conversations. It is also why people delay everything until 45 or 50. Because nothing hurts yet, so urgency feels fake. And then you hear the Titanic metaphor and it just lands. If the iceberg is 40 years away, apparently we call that freedom. That is depressingly accurate. But the retirement analogy is even better. Nobody wants to save today for a body they have not met yet. Until they are older and begging for time they never invested in. The part about exercise lowering all-cause mortality from basically nothing to something huge is crazy. Going from zero activity to 90 minutes a week is absurdly high leverage. That is not even elite athlete stuff. That is just basic movement. And yet basic is the hardest thing to sell people on. Because basic sounds boring until basic saves your life. I think what makes him powerful is he refuses to make this moral. He does not say you are bad if you are unhealthy. He just says the trajectory is real whether you like it or not. That makes it easier to hear because shame is useless here. The emotional health piece is where it gets unexpectedly heavy, though. He basically admits he was physically optimized and still miserable. That is the part that should scare ambitious people the most. Because you can win every health metric and still be a menace. A cardio monster with terrible character, basically. The resume virtues versus eulogy virtues thing is nasty in the best way. It cuts straight through the fake scoreboard people live on. Workaholism looks productive until it starts eating the person inside it. And he is honest that he was detached, angry, selfish. That honesty is rare because most people would rather hide behind success. Success is a very good hiding place. The funeral story was the moment, right? Nobody talked about the career, only the kind of person she was. That is such a hard mirror to stand in front of, especially if your life has been organized around output. He is basically saying output is not identity, which sounds obvious until your whole culture rewards output. Then it suddenly feels like a revolutionary thought. And then trauma enters, which I did not expect either. That chapter sounds like the book opens a trapdoor on itself. He basically stops being the doctor and becomes the patient. That move is way braver than just staying in expert mode. Because it is easy to lecture people about habits from a safe distance. It is harder to say this is what was broken in me, and then connect that brokenness to behavior, not just biology. That is why the emotional health section hits so hard. Because it says longevity without inner repair is a half project. A very expensive half project. Also, that line about the therapist calling out his misery was savage. Sometimes you need a professional to ruin your favorite excuses. That is exactly why therapy works and why people avoid it. But it makes sense that emotional regulation would belong here. If your relationships are collapsing, your health is not really intact. People want health to mean labs only because labs are easier. Labs do not ask if you are present with your kids, or if you are poisoning your own marriage with success addiction, which is annoyingly not on a checklist. What I like is that he never says prevention is glamorous. He just says the future is being built now, whether you notice or not. Which is rude, because now I have to care before it hurts. That is the whole scam of maturity, honestly. I think that is a good place to leave it for this episode. We have not even touched biomarkers, personalization, or the fights that come next. And that is where this gets really messy in the best way. Episode 2 is where everybody starts arguing with their own blood work. That one is coming up next, and it gets way more specific.